Hi everyone, this is a recording for Competency 1 of the Pedagogy, Instruction, and Assessment section of the LOTE. Alright, so pedagogy is just the art, science, or profession of teaching. It includes the strategies and methods we need to use to be effective teachers. And remember that all instruction should be learner-centered or focused on the needs of students. Alright, so 34.6% of the exam is on pedagogy, instruction, and assessment. That's why even native and heritage speakers fail this test because they might be completely fluent in Spanish, very strong in Spanish, but if they don't study this material, then they can't pass the test. 26.6% are the multiple choice questions on pedagogy, and the remaining 8% is the lesson plan and essay. So when you add this up, that's where we get this 34.6%. Over a third of the exam is pedagogy, instruction, and assessment. Those questions are in English. The pedagogy questions are. All right, the first topic we're covering is interlanguage. And interlanguage is a linguistic system that develops when someone is learning L2, but they're still making mistakes that are related to L1, and they're also making mistakes from overgeneralizing rules that they learn. So this theory was proposed by Larry Selinker. You do need to know his name for the test. And again, he says interlanguage is when you're speaking L2, but making mistakes related to L1, language 1, and also overgeneralizing rules. So they might be mispronouncing words, pronouncing words like they would be in English, right? So that would be a mistake related to L1. They might be using false cognates, right? So they might say something like, the common one that everybody knows and laughs about is embarazada, right? Thinking that that's embarrassed, but we know that that means pregnant. So that would be a mistake related to L1, right? Because it's a false cognate. Overgeneralizing, they might learn how to conjugate verbs, but there's always irregular verbs, right? So if they're conjugating it according to the rules, they're overgeneralizing. So an example would be instead they might say he escribido instead of he escrito, okay? Or they might say conducí instead of conduje, right? So they're overgeneralizing, right? Another example of overgeneralizing is if they learn that if a word ends in a, we usually say la before it for the article, but it's el agua, not la agua. So that would also be overgeneralizing. All right, L1, you've already heard me talking about that, is language 1, the language a person already knows. L2 is the language a person is learning or has learned, also called the target language. BICS is basic interpersonal communicative skills. That's basic conversational skills that students pick up pretty quickly, very often in a year. Whereas CALP, cognitive academic language proficiency, takes 4 to 7 years to develop, and that is the language you need to be successful in the classroom. Academic, high-level language, right? Specific terminology. All right, so now we have language acquisition versus language learning. When you acquire something, it happens naturally. So that's how babies learn L1, right? They get lots of input. The parents or caretakers talk to them a lot. They're getting a lot of input, not really explicit instruction on grammar. They learn it indirectly from all of the input, from the reading and the talking and the playing. Language learning is not as communicative and is the result of direct instruction. Young children are not ready for complex grammar rules. So, language learning is not used for little tiny kids because it's not effective. But it has been used traditionally to teach L2. Now research is showing, and second language acquisition experts are promoting, that we use acquisition techniques even to teach L2 or to help students acquire L2. So again, we already talked about interlanguage, but make sure you know that by Larry Selinker, again, when they're speaking L2, but making mistakes still, right? All right, there's different cognitive processes involved, whether you're learning L1 or L2 or acquiring. So generally, people learn L1 when they're babies, toddlers, right? And they learn L2 when they're older, usually. There's always exceptions. So L1 is acquired with little effort, and formal instruction is not used for babies. They learn by imitating caregivers, okay? Generally, L2 is learned in a formal education setting, and L2 learners are older. So they have more formal understanding of language and rules, a longer attention span, and can benefit from direct instruction. All right, these are super important. You do need to know the language learning theories. So we have communicative language teaching or communicative approaches using interaction and communication, including role play and authentic texts to teach language. So again, that's communicative language teaching. And the key there is authentic texts, texts that are originally from a Spanish-speaking country. Content-based approaches use content or subjects to teach students language in a meaningful way. So they use different subjects. So you might be teaching Spanish, but a math lesson in Spanish. All right, communicative language teaching. These approaches are they link communication and language learning to real-world situations. These theories are somewhat influenced by Noam Chomsky, who said that humans are naturally or biologically designed to learn language. So he's known for the nativist perspective, which says we're designed to learn language. Okay. Now, the communicative language teaching approaches has 4 what they call competences that you do need to know for the test. The first one is grammatical competence, which is what it sounds like, using language accurately, including syntax, which is sentence structure, spelling, vocabulary, pronunciation. So it's using grammar correctly. So if you have grammatical competence, you use words correctly and grammar correctly, like correct order of words, spelling, pronunciation. Next, we have sociolinguistic competence, which is using language appropriately according to the social setting or context, keeping in mind social norms, customs, and linguistic register. So it'd be knowing when to use tú and when to use usted, knowing how to greet people, maybe realizing that it's not as common to shake hands in Spanish-speaking societies. It's more common to give a kiss on the cheek and say mucho gusto or encantado. So that's sociolinguistic competence. Next, we have discourse competence, which is being able to use phrases and connect them appropriately in a coherent way, and for both speaking and writing. Okay, in different settings, so professional, casual, different settings. And the last one is strategic competence, using strategies to appropriately enter or exit a conversation, to end a silent period in a conversation, be able to speak when it's a person's turn, and find ways to improve communication when facing obstacles. So maybe you can tell that somebody's not understanding you and you clarify, or you're not understanding a speaker and you ask for clarification. That would be strategies. Noam Chomsky, like we talked about the nativist perspective, he's also known for universal grammar theory, which says that we naturally develop a sense of grammar under normal circumstances. He also believed everybody has a language acquisition device, LAD, which helps us understand grammatical rules and rules of language. All right, Lev Vygotsky is known for the interactionist theory, and he explains that language acquisition is both biological and social. His theory emphasizes the importance of using collaboration in the classroom to help students develop linguistically and develop higher thinking skills, cognitive development. That's Lev Vygotsky. You might see his name on the PPR also. All right, Stephen Krashen is the king of second language acquisition. You will see probably more than one question about Stephen Krashen on the test. His first hypothesis or theory is the acquisition learning hypothesis. And he says that language acquisition is when a language is naturally picked up. And this happens when babies learn L1 or their native language, right? There's not direct instruction, not specific grammar lessons, anything like that. Whereas language learning is with conscious effort, direct instruction. And he says that we should use acquisition approaches even for L2. So for both L1 and L2, we should use acquisition techniques. Next, we have the monitor hypothesis, that as we're learning a language, we monitor our errors. While it sounds like it can be beneficial, and it can be, if you overuse it, it'll inhibit fluency because people are worried so much about perfection and correcting errors that they're not attaining fluency. Okay, next we have natural order hypothesis, that there's a natural order that people learn a language for both L1 and L2. And we do find this to be the case for both L1 and L2. When toddlers are learning to speak, first they just say single words, and then they'll do two-word sentences, and then later multi-word sentences. And they always start with the present tense before they learn future or past tense. And it's the same thing for L2. So as teachers, we want to keep that in mind, because if we try to teach the concepts in a different order, it will cause frustration for both teacher and students. Next, we have the input hypothesis. This is probably the most important one. You need to know all of them, but this one is super important. Teachers or caregivers should use comprehensible input. That just means language that the teacher uses that the student can already understand. Comprehensible input. So think of the word comprender in Spanish, right? So they can already understand it. You also need to use comprehensible input +1. You might see it on the test as I+1. And that's language that is just above the student's current level. When you use language that is above their level, this I+1 or comprehensible input +1, it is super important to always use scaffolding, which is extra support to help them understand this more advanced language, right? So scaffolding is things like, includes nonverbal cues, body language, gestures, rephrasing, explaining, etc. The fifth hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis. Notice this is with an A, not with an E. And this is all about creating a classroom environment where students are not afraid of being made fun of or making mistakes, right? They'll learn better when the affective filter is low, where they feel comfortable and willing to participate. And last, the reading hypothesis is super obvious. The more you read in L2, the more vocabulary you'll learn, which will help with language acquisition. Right. Content-based approaches means you're teaching L2, so you're teaching Spanish in this case, but you're teaching it using other subjects. So you're maybe doing a math or a science lesson, okay, in Spanish. The grammar translation method is not a content-based method, and it's not a communicative language teaching method, but it's probably going to be on your test. And in the grammar translation method, students learn grammar rules and then translate sentences. It was used to teach Greek and Latin, but as you can imagine, if that's all they were doing was grammar rules and then translating sentences, they didn't really gain proficiency in speaking or listening comprehension. So it's not popular anymore. Next, we have the Audiolingual Method, which is also called the Army Method or the New Key Method, and it's based on the behaviorist theory. So it uses positive and negative feedback or reinforcement. So what happens when you hear audiolingual, think of audio like hearing and lingual like talking. So the teacher plays oral drills or says oral drills, and then the students repeat it. So audiolingual, hearing and speaking. Right? The target language is used. They do learn grammar from the drills. So even though they're not having direct grammar lessons, they learn it from the drills. It was super popular up until about the 1950s. And people still use elements of it, of course, but it's not as widely used. And this is a sample question that you'll get in my course, so I skip over these for the videos. But next we have factors affecting second language acquisition. So of course, if they're motivated, they're going to learn faster, right? If L1 and L2 are related, this helps them learn. So English and Spanish, even though they're not the same type of language, they do have quite a few cognates and they have similar sentence structure or syntax. So that helps learning a language. Language transfer is when your knowledge of L1 transfers to L2 or applies to L2. It can be positive or helpful, like cognates and similar syntax, or it can be negative, and then it's called language interference, like false cognates. Okay, we already talked about overgeneralization. Remember when you learn a grammar rule and you apply it all the time? So maybe instead of saying he escrito, they say he escribido. They're overgeneralizing. They should say he escrito. Family attitude and behavior. You always want to think perfect world on this test. So, you know, especially when kids are teenagers, they don't really care what their parents want them to do. In fact, they might even rebel against what their parents want them to do. But on the test, you want to think that the family attitude and behavior, if they're supportive of the kid learning a language, it would help them learn a language. Differentiated instruction, hopefully you've already learned about this in your certification program. It's where we plan instruction for all types of learners, visual, auditory, kinesthetic learners. We take into account their interests, any special needs. If they're advanced learners, heritage speakers, native speakers, we take that into account and plan lessons that will support and challenge everybody, right? No matter what level they're at. So on your lesson plan, it's really good to mention how you will differentiate instruction. Interdisciplinary units, so interconnecting, right? Disciplinary, coming from subjects, right? So it's when you connect different subjects. So maybe you plan a lesson on grammar, teaching something about verbs, and you pick out verbs that relate to science and social studies and even art. And so you have an overarching theme of grammar, but you're connecting different subjects. And another example, interdisciplinary units can be used in any type of classroom, not just Spanish. So my daughter did an interdisciplinary unit in first grade on Johnny Appleseed. So they read about that for social studies. They studied the life cycle of an apple tree in science, and in art, they drew a picture of an apple tree. And for math, they learned about fractions by the teacher cutting up apples, and they followed a simple recipe to make applesauce in different crock pots that she set up with parent volunteers. So that was interdisciplinary. You can definitely do that in Spanish class too. Connecting different subjects. You could even do the same type of lesson with in Spanish about apples and make it more appropriate for the age group you're working with. You need to know the different types of programs that teach foreign language. This is in elementary school. Foreign language experience program. It's an enrichment program designed for limited exposure to 1 or 2 foreign languages in elementary school. The main emphasis is on spoken oral language and learning about other cultures. So teachers in flex programs use games, cultural activities, stories, and music to teach basic vocabulary. So the goal is exposure, not proficiency. That's important. Okay, so exposure, not proficiency. And the EX helps me think of exposure, experience and exposure, not proficiency. Whereas the FLES program, Foreign Language in Elementary School, is designed with sequential instruction, sequential language instruction, and they are expected to develop some level of proficiency. So my kids have been in 2 different FLES programs, and they met at least twice a week. So it's the FLEX programs probably just meet once a week. Immersion programs, everything is taught in L2. So everything would be taught in Spanish, all subjects. Bilingual education, probably won't see this on the test, but just in case it comes up on one of the speaking tasks or something. Bilingual teachers teach the core subjects, math, science, social studies, language arts, in both languages. So it's to help kids learn English, but also maintain their Spanish or whatever home language they have. When we plan lessons, we want to use elements from different approaches, right? Tie in other subjects and also use communicative language teaching strategies. Everything needs to be based on the TEKS, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills. If you're using district approved curriculum, it will follow the TEKS. And that's a sample question. And that concludes Competency 1.